opens diagonals for both queen and bishop, immediately challenging the center and setting up rapid development. Instantly mirroring white's central pawn, establishes a balanced starting position and opens diagonals for both queens and bishops. Developing the knight to f3 immediately challenges black's central pawn and prepares for castling, establishing a solid foundation. Provoking an immediate pawn confrontation on the central e-file, this counterthrust seeks to disrupt white's initial pawn majority and create active piece play. Boldly striking at the center, white immediately challenges black's pawn and seeks to dictate the early game's tactical geometry. Accepting the central pawn gambit opens lines for immediate development and potential counterplay across the e-file. Challenging the knight's position immediately offers a positional advantage, creating space for white's pieces. This knight's daring advance to e4, though seemingly exposed, aims to disrupt white's pawn center and potentially forge a dynamic counterplay. Challenging the knight directly forces a decision, aiming to exploit the piece's exposed position and potentially disrupt black's development by opening lines. Boldly challenging the central pawn advance, the knight aggressively repositions, creating immediate skirmishes and probing for weaknesses in white's exposed queen. Reclaiming the center pawn, white immediately initiates a fascinating positional skirmish, creating immediate threats to black's queen while simultaneously solidifying control over crucial central squares. This bold recapture forces black to make a difficult decision about their queen's placement, potentially sacrificing development for safety. Observe how the knight now occupies a dominant outpost, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's burgeoning pawn structure. The game is rapidly entering a dynamic phase, where tactical alertness will be paramount for both sides. Developing the knight to a more central square, this piece now eyes key squares like d4 and f4, potentially disrupting white's pawn chain and offering counterplay. Forcing a structural shift, this capture immediately targets black's pawn chain and prepares to exploit the resulting doubled pawns, creating a long-term positional imbalance. Opening the b-file for your rook offers a dynamic counterplay, though it surrenders central pawn structure and creates a doubled pawn. Developing the knight to c3 shores up central influence and prepares for potential pawn pushes, while the doubled c-pawns present black with a curious structural quandary that may limit his piece mobility in the long run. Asserting pressure along the semi-open b-file, this move aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses. The rook now eyes the c-pawn and the entire queen side, forcing white to consider defensive measures instead of continuing their kingside initiative. Initiating a pawn offensive on the kingside creates immediate threats against black's potentially vulnerable monarch, aiming to exploit the weakened structure following bxc6, while also contesting control of the central files. Developing the bishop to e7 wisely prepares for castling kingside, securing the monarch from immediate threats and reinforcing the pawn chain. Shifting the queen to the f2 square sets up a dual threat, both pressuring the c6 pawn and offering a potential escape route should the kingside become compromised. It's a subtle repositioning aimed at increasing offensive potential while maintaining defensive flexibility. Black finally confronts the central pawn and opens a vital diagonal for their bishop, a necessary step to counter white's impressive pawn chain and the looming kingside pressure. This pawn push fundamentally reshapes the battlefield, inviting tactical skirmishes and demanding careful calculation from both sides as the game enters a critical juncture where piece activity and central control become paramount. Developing the bishop to this square strengthens the center and prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while also creating a battery with the queen aimed at the enemy king's precarious pawn shield. Shifting the knight to d7 creates an interesting positional dilemma, momentarily sacrificing pawn structure for potential piece activity and reinforcing the central squares. Securing the king on the queen side opens up the c-file for potential infiltration and prepares an active defense should black's central pawn advance become problematic. Castling queenside provides immediate shelter for the king while simultaneously bringing a rook towards the central files, contesting the open d-file and potentially supporting a pawn advance later on. Unleashing a pawn storm toward the queenside, 13. G4 aggressively challenges black's pawn structure and seeks to disrupt the harmony of their pieces, potentially creating weaknesses around the castled king and aiming to seize more territory. Unleashing a bold diagonal threat, black immediately targets white's unprotected c3 knight, aiming to disrupt its coordination and create immediate counterplay against white's ambitious kingside pawn push. Releasing the knight from its initial outpost, white repositions it towards a more active central square, aiming to influence d5 and potentially support a kingside advance, while also creating a subtle threat of regrouping to f4 or g3 to bolster the pawn shield. The knight finds a more active outpost, eyeing the central weakness created by white's pushed pawns. Unleashing a knight to d4 aims to re-establish central influence and challenge black's queenside pawn chain, particularly the c6 pawn, which has become a target after the pawn structure exchange. This maneuver also opens lines for white's own pieces and prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside, hinting at an aggressive middle game plan while simultaneously offering a potential pawn sacrifice for activity if black isn't careful. Instead of shoring up the pawn chain, black ventures to reposition the queen to e8, seeking to connect rooks and perhaps prepare for future c5 advances or g6 followed by bg7, aiming to leverage the open queenside files and potentially exploit white's somewhat exposed king position. Challenging the pawn chain's integrity, c3 creates a decisive pawn structure decision, forcing a reassessment of black's central control and potentially opening avenues for white's rooks. Consolidating the bishop's position on e7 aims to prepare for a potential retreat to d6, reinforcing the queenside pawn structure and possibly offering a haven should the queenside become too compromised by white's aggressive pawn advances. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, 17. f5 aggressively challenges black's defensive setup and seeks to shatter the pawn shield protecting the monarch. This bold advance immediately creates an imbalance, potentially opening lines for white's pieces while forcing black to react defensively. The question now becomes whether black can absorb this pressure, or if white's territorial gains will prove too much to overcome. Cracking open the center with this pawn thrust unleashes dynamic possibilities, aiming to disrupt white's kingside structure and exploit the newly opened lines for black's pieces. Initiating a bold spatial invasion, white's knight leaps to a commanding outpost, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and threaten the vulnerable c7 square. Unleashing a pawn storm, black immediately confronts white's central buildup, aiming to shatter the pawn chain and open lines for their rooks. Securing the d4 pawn with the bishop, white prepares a potential kingside assault while simultaneously challenging black's central control and opening a path for the c1 bishop. A bold strike for central influence, black ignites a tactical tempest by sacrificing material to shatter white's pawn structure and expose the king. Unleashing the knight to its central outpost offers a robust defense against black's pawn storm, simultaneously eyeing the vulnerable d5 pawn and preparing to join the battle on the kingside. Unleashing the knight to a4, black aims to disrupt white's rook on c3 and potentially infiltrate the queenside, forcing a reassessment of white's pawn structure and piece coordination after the recent exchanges. Unlocking the c-file is the primary aim here, leveraging the exposed nature of black's queenside pawn structure. This maneuver seeks to exploit the potential for tactical fireworks by repositioning the bishop to a square where it can exert pressure on the queenside, potentially creating weaknesses or forcing black into defensive concessions. The bishop's journey to b5 is a delicate dance, aiming to disrupt black's nascent coordination while simultaneously preparing for a potential central pawn thrust or piece activity. White is looking to activate this bishop from its somewhat passive square on f4, seeking more dynamic influence over the board. Observe how the repositioning of the bishop prepares for further pawn advances or potential piece exchanges that could favor white's initiative. The black knight, having been rerouted to a4, now dives into the heart of white's queenside, seeking to unravel the pawn structure and create immediate complications. The ensuing sequence with the rook capture, 21, rxb5*, is a bold attempt to exploit the open b-file and generate counterplay against white's king, which is still exposed on the queen side. This radical maneuver signals a shift towards sharp tactical exchanges, aiming to disrupt white's queenside control and perhaps gain a tempo or two for further initiative. It's a calculated gamble, sacrificing material for dynamic possibilities. The position immediately becomes unbalanced. White must carefully assess whether the material advantage is sufficient to withstand the incoming storm, or if the doubled pawns on the c-file and the open files will prove too much to handle. The pawn sacrifice on c5 earlier by black has clearly paid dividends by opening lines of attack. A decisive pivot, this knight capture on a4 initiates a sequence that aims to dismantle black's attacking battery on the queen side and subsequently exploit the weakened dark squares around the black king. By removing the pesky knight, white simultaneously opens the file for potential future operations and avoids allowing black further tactical complications that might arise from the knight's repositioning or support of pawn advances. The positional advantage gained through simplifying this complex queenside skirmish should enable white to focus on generating threats against the now less defended black monarch. The rook reestablishes its influence on the open file, threatening to infiltrate white's queenside if the knight vacates its outpost, all while providing a potential defensive shield for the king should the center collapse. Unlocking the c-file now becomes white's immediate priority, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially pressure the b-pawn after the exchange on the queen side. The bishop's retreat to b7 subtly reestablishes a defensive screen for the king's side, anticipating potential pawn pushes from white's f-pawn and aiming to control the critical diagonal. This redeployment also prepares for potential piece exchanges, aiming to simplify the position while maintaining activity. Reclaiming the e-file is a priority, aiming to open lines of attack and potentially pressure black's queenside structure. Securing the monarch from potential open file harassment, this repositioning anticipates threats along the newly opened g-file while preparing to contest the central pawn majority and improve the knight's central presence. Unleashing a decisive pawn storm, white seeks to shatter black's defensive shell and expose the monarch. Seeking to secure the bishop and potentially reposition it to a more active square on the queen side, black initiates a careful repositioning maneuver after white's aggressive pawn thrust. Unleashing a potent threat to the weakened dark squares around black's monarch, this bishop advance decisively pierces the diagonal, forcing black to reckon with an immediate attack on their king's safety, potentially disrupting their defensive setup. The immediate capture of the bishop on g5** forces a reevaluation of black's pawn structure and offers a chance to simplify the position. A thunderclap of discovery, striking the opponent's king with a forced sacrifice that rips open a deadly diagonal and exposes the monarch to a swift, decisive attack. Accepting this sacrifice dramatically alters the landscape, exposing your monarch to immediate danger but promising a powerful counterattack should white mishandle their advantage. Unleashing a calculated sacrifice, white aims to expose the enemy monarch by stripping away essential defensive pieces, hoping the resulting checks create an irresistible mating net. The king's desperate sprint away from the menacing bishop on f6 reveals a critical defensive flaw, leaving the g7 pawn exposed and inviting a cascade of tactical threats. Suddenly, the queen becomes a piercing lance aimed directly at black's exposed monarch, initiating a desperate race against time to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure before black can consolidate. Trading queens here fundamentally alters the dynamic. Black initiates a sequence that clears the d-file, potentially opening avenues for their remaining pieces, while also inviting white's king into a more exposed central position, with less defensive cover, as the material advantage begins to shift towards a more favorable endgame scenario for black. A desperate gambit to ignite a kingside attack has now plunged into a messy sequence of exchanges, and nxd1 offers a chance to simplify into a potentially better ending by clearing the central diagonal, though it leaves white's king exposed.